I want to start off a little bit differently than I normally would, and I'm going to venture into some territory that makes me nervous. As you may have at least read my title, I'm a sociologist of religion, and certainly when I was in graduate school, I did not want to go into theological education. That classroom scared me. I'm a Quaker. The idea of teaching people who had to be up in front of congregations and doing work that I had never had to do was just like terrifying. And here I am. I was hired in 1992, and I have to say I was hired on a faculty that already had two people working on this, a theologian and a liturgical homiletics professor. So I had it easy compared to many of you. And that has been a real blessing. And so over the years, I've tried to refine a voice that speaks to where my students are, and actually it's freed me up a little bit. And so I'm going to start off first with this context of the air we breathe. Breathing is one of our most intimate interactions with the creation, if you think about it. And when I was on a walk, like Beth talked about, this is part of our Arboretum at Drew, and we take our students during orientation here now. But I also have a training in biology, and as I was on a walk, I found myself, I'm deeply grateful for trees. You know, trees are grounded in the earth and reach toward heaven. They are these transition wonderful. And I found myself thinking about the planet's respiration cycle. That briefly put, scientists, don't, I know the complexities of it, but we could say briefly that plants breathe out oxygen, which we breathe in, and we respire, we breathe out the carbon dioxide they need. And so it's this breathing together. We are the planet breathing together. And we don't have that air without each other. And so I got to thinking about this exchange of God's breath. In Hebrew, and this is where I get worried, I'm straying far from, I guess I had a very interdisciplinary education at Candler, but in Hebrew, the term ruach, which we often translate as spirit, is also used for breath, for air, for atmosphere, for wind. Ted Hebert, who has taught me so much on this and is a fine biblical ecological hermeneuticist, has done some really good work on this. And this is what he reminds me. That air is not regarded as a material element of the natural world, which is a created substance, is empty of divinity. On the contrary, air is both atmospheric winds and breath, is described in the Hebrew scriptures as having a divine character. The second verse of the book of Genesis, I'm figuring you can read faster than I can talk, in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures contains it. The King James Version translated as spirit, as if spirit is somehow separate from body, that dualism. And that's because it was translating from the Latin spiritus. And yet we read also about the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters. In the NRSV, it's translated as the wind of God. And Hebert asks, what if we translated it as air as breath, the breath of God hovering? What if we then understood in this one chapter later in Genesis 2:7 that the term is part of the phrase breath of life? God breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. This phrase, breath of life, is found in many places, perhaps notably in the Noah account, as descriptive of all the animals on the ark. Or in Psalm 33:6, by the word of the Lord the skies were made, and by the breath of God's mouth all of their creatures. This implies that the Ruach, the breath of God, is what animates all of us. All of us are creatures animated by God's breath, just as the world is animated by God's breath. This means it's inaccurate to see spirit as if it is something separate, because we cannot be bodies without breath. It is integral to who we are. Catherine Keller, Mike Drew co-conspirator, I call her, in her extended reflections on pneumatology and spirit in Face the Deep, comments that the pneumatic oscillation of storm, wind, breath, spirit, which is not something sent from a God above, but who is whatever is divine. Keller and Hebert both argue that because of a mind-body split, dualism is read back into this text, and we miss the significance that breath and spirit are the same. So this erases a distinction we might make between human creatures and other animal creatures. But it also brings some very clear questions to our mind, because it brings plants in as essential to the circle of life. And put simply, we can't breathe without them. But in light of this theological, what I like to call conspiring, we are all respiring together. Deforestation and air pollution, the degrading of human, planet, and animal life is the defilement of God, the destruction of the breath of life. So I ask you, conspirators with me, co-respirators, respiring animals, to become conspiratorial with me, with all of God's creation. And I want to use this as an example of the multiple dimensions, because the words "I can't breathe" are horrifying and alarming to think about. But they take us to another level, because these are the haunting words of Eric Gardner in the sickening video filmed not far from where I teach of his being choked to death by the police officers. "I can't breathe" has become the symbol, the symbolic understanding of the Black Lives Matter movement, in a way that reminds us that millions of people around the globe can't breathe, that they are being choked by the air they breathe, and that air is related to our actions. It's related to the stuff we buy, the stuff we drive. And I loved that earlier today, I think it was the Monsignor talked about light and darkness doesn't even have the same meaning when you live in such a polluted city, that at night the light reflects and in the day you can't see the sun. So I just want to remind us that in many places the asthma rate is 4 times higher in places like Newark and Trenton, the areas where many of our Drew students come from, that people live in areas where they can't move away from. And that's where polluting industries are put. That's where the garbage transfer sites are. That's where the trucks idle for the Port of Newark to bring in all of our consumer goods. And so this notion of what does it mean to share God's breath always has in it, what does it mean to care for the stranger, for the neighbor, for the other? What does it mean to live in right relations with each other? What does it mean to work for justice? And this brings in all sorts of issues we've been talking about. Imagine if you live near a concentrated animal feedlot, a CAFO. What does it mean in North Carolina to constantly have to breathe the smell of pig manure from the huge holding ponds? What does it mean to live near places where meat is processed? So I want us to think about then the ethical reach of our actions and how we help our students connect from such a wonderful theological moment that the air we breathe is God's breath, to how we defile God's breath and then ask people to breathe in that evil. So, this task of conspiring, of recognizing the connections and conditions that stifle human and ecosystem thriving, this stifling the breath that fully enlivens, is our task in theological education. And so I want to shift more now to talking about theological education and some of what we are doing. I don't have to remind you why it's so important to focus on theological education. And I just want to say and pause for a moment that as one of the co-founders of the Green Seminary Initiative, to have all of you in this room is such a wonderful blessing. So enlivening, so humbling, so gratifying to have these things we dreamed about come to fruition. And I just want to say how much I have learned from all of you today. That maybe I don't have that much I need to say up here because you've said so much. But I want to remind us that we are in a unique place in some ways because our students range from fresh out of college to retirees to second career people. And we are privileged to be in a classroom where the values and language of care for the neighbor, the stranger, of justice, of right relations is what we can talk about. It is the stuff of our education. That we teach in places where there are scriptural, textual foundations for our work, that we are busy enlivening. That theological education reaches out to critical communities in ways that so much else doesn't. And that our students shape the learning of those in their houses of worship. Or as I remember when I was being convinced to take a job in theological education, what you teach on Tuesday can be preached on Sunday. And boy, have I seen that happen. And that is about the biggest compliment you can give me as a teacher. That what I taught you was worth translating to your congregation. But I also want to point out that houses of worship are first responders. They are crisis centers. And if we take seriously what is coming down the pipe, if we take seriously Katrina and Sandy and droughts and floods, we have got to be preparing our students for being those centers for healing, for bringing community back together. In other words, if we are not preparing our students on this topic to be religious leaders, we are still preparing them for yesterday and not for tomorrow's church, not for tomorrow's reality. So I want you to take seriously what you have heard today and to acknowledge that the Monsignor this morning unfolding Laudato Si for us, Tim and Elaine's presentation, so many of your comments from the floor, you have already so clearly articulated how it is all integrated. And our task is then to change, that no one is ever changed by a pie chart. That is what we've been talking about today. Just more knowledge, more words, more facts is not enough. That a cognitive fix, just changing our theology or something, is not enough. Because what we have to take seriously, and what's in our classroom every day, is that our theology, our words, don't necessarily translate into changed action. Every educator knows that, every sociologist knows that. What we know and what we do are different, and I think you are the one that's been bringing up some of the psychology. You know, I'm learning so much in paying attention to the psychology of denial, the psychology of living with cognitive dissonance. It's a really important conversation. So this is what I've heard today, just summarizing quickly. All of these different things have been talked about. And making the connections are so important. So instead of going back over these things, which I hope you have heard too, I want to talk a little bit more about values and about practices, about moving beyond words to how we get these things to be embedded in our students' lives. Because theological education is not based on the banking model. It shouldn't be, at least. It is not about depositing a certain body of knowledge in our students' brains that then they're supposed to figure out what to do with, how to take it out into the world. And what we know is the problem with that model is then students don't claim ownership of it. It doesn't enliven them, and it also means we're not listening to them. So I think you've heard me in many settings say, learn where your students are and start where they are. Find the different issues that motivate them. And then connect it with experience so that knowledge sticks. Connect it with experience so it comes alive. Provide avenues for new narratives, new stories. And what I loved about Elaine's talk is reminding us that the voices we listen to and whose stories we pay attention to deeply impact us and make a moral demand on us. So who are the voices that your students are listening to? Who are the voices that you're bringing into the classroom or taking them out to meet and talk to and learn from? Because we've got to have a different model of knowledge. One of my favorite exercises is to have my students have to pick a place that they get to know throughout the semester. Because I want them to learn from the creation. To realize that the book of nature is the first revelation. And what does it have to teach us when we learn to be still? When we learn that there are other ways of knowing that don't come from a teacher, that don't come from a book, that don't come from any words, but come from experience. And then I want us to acknowledge that emotions really are what cement these things together. We can talk about values all day and they don't necessarily translate to actions. But when we have an emotional connection to it, when we can make those emotional connections come alive for our students, that's what then leads to changed identities. And changed identities lead to changed actions and changed attitudes. And what our task really is how do we get our students to be change agents when they walk out the door? They are changed when they are in our presence in theological. I don't know about you, I have never met a student who went to seminary, who went to theological education, who didn't come out changed. And if they didn't come out changed, then boy, they weren't listening. And they weren't talking. So it's how do we get in this kind of learning on the ground that Jennifer Ayers talks about in a lot of her work. She's another Emory grad. We're not really making a case for Emory, but we have a pretty good conversation going on among those of us who graduated. And she emphasizes constantly this notion of practices, that practices help these things come alive. So, I don't think I have to go over this slide. This is the good news. Oh dear. Really? I don't think I'm quite at time, but I might be. And this is the kind of activity I'm okay? I said it too soon. This is the kind of activity that I was at a gathering here in Washington a couple of years ago of the many kinds of religious activists working on these topics. This was the conversation they mentioned. So there is so much space. Okay, I gotcha. I'm over. So many ways to connect our students. And so one of the things that I've learned is to come up with classes that start on these very different places. Because I'll have students come in for a religion and animals class that wouldn't come in if I called it ecology. I'll have students come in for an environmental justice class that wouldn't come in if I called it religion and animals. I have students who come in on religions and food, and they're working on food justice and food deserts and community gardening. And then I have others who come in because they're concerned about health issues of pesticides. And getting those folks in the same classroom is really powerful. So the other task I think we have is reminding our students to re-inhabit their traditions in new ways. And I am on like this crusade. I'm not a Methodist, but I have to say, as a Quaker, when I first read this Wesley quote, I now, every time I can, because I want you to hear that eco-theology is nothing new. God is in all things, and that we are to see the Creator in the face of every creature, that we should use and look upon nothing as separate from God, which is indeed a kind of practical atheism. In other words, to not see God in this world, in other creatures, is indeed a kind of practical atheism. And I come out of, at one point, I was formed by a fundamentalist sort of background, and boy, to see God in this world was a big no-no. I also want to bring up Hans Jonas, who has really been an important voice for me. I could include Howard Thurman here. There's so many of these voices. But I really, this outcry of mute things to remind us of when we're in the classroom, how many other voices can't be heard. And I think this is just a really powerful quote. And then I want to switch to a little bit of the social science, and I want to assure you that what is said from the pulpit counts. And here's a little bit of data on that, because I do find that as a sociologist, I like to check in and see, does any of it matter? This was really powerful, but I want you to see who are the people that hear their clergy leader discussing climate change the most. It is not white Protestants or white Catholics. Who hears it the most are Hispanic Catholics, black Protestants, and then all the rest of us white folks look about the same. That's pretty discouraging as someone who has worked for a long time in a predominantly white Protestant denomination. But thankfully, my classroom is now as diverse as what we are seeing. And this makes a difference because it translates into who is the most concerned. Now, I know lots of folks, when I've sort of shown them this data, they're really surprised. Because they may have been in communities where they said, you know, environmental issues are just a luxury. We've got to worry about how we get food on the table. Environmental issues are a rich concern, a white concern, a privileged concern, and I think Tim and Elaine already talked about that. I think the Laudato Si talks about undoing that. But there's a good reason for why these statistics read the way they do. And that is, who can imagine who will be harmed by climate change? Who can imagine who will be infected by environmental degradation? And if our students think it's not going to affect people like them, you talked about earlier about our circle of moral concern all too often stops with those that we can see. If our students don't think it's going to happen to people like them, then it's really hard to get them. So you've got to figure out that way that they can imagine what this degradation, this unraveling, dissolving of creation is going to mean for whoever, whatever they hold dear, and then expand and expand and expand that circle of concern. So, I think you've heard a lot about the Green Seminary Initiative and why we founded it. We founded it in part because places like Union didn't replace Larry Rasmussen, and places like Vanderbilt didn't replace Sally McVeigh. So we had these institutions where some of the early eco-theologians were teaching, and when those folks retired, the institution didn't think it was important enough to replace them. So that was part of it, but I hope you also know and have heard of the work of other organizations that are doing important work on this. We are different audiences, and it's important, all of this work, and there's so many other groups doing this. But I want you to notice just one more time this circle of the 5 areas. Only one of them is about the explicit curriculum. All of these are about the implicit curriculum. And just a couple of examples from Drew. It's anchored in many of our required courses. And it's the kind of themes that come in, you've already heard so many of them, but it's wonderful. It's this very multifaceted conversation. These are my courses, and I just wanted to start off with talking about my required course, which is not the place you'd expect it. It is a course on the relationship between religion and legitimating social structures and challenging them. I think it's a course that's at the heart of what the gospel is. That religion legitimates structures of injustice, and religion can challenge it. We can bless and we damn. So in that course, I take sexism and racism and heterosexism and economic issues and ableism and immigration and food systems and globalization and violence, and I show my students how it's connected to all of this. And students, I'm happy to say, these are students coming out of that required course where they sort of didn't expect this to end up being also about the environment all the time. But what you need is for it to be so much in the atmosphere that they breathe that then becomes part of who they are. And I think this happens at Drew. I have worked a long time at Drew on walking our talk, because you can say all sorts of things in the classroom, and if it is not in your institutional practices, then the students are just going to say, you're all talk. I want to remind you that for many of our students, what we talk about when we talk about the environment, these are the headlines of their lives. They are angry, they are pissed, they are despairing, and they are looking at my generation and saying, you guys, you haven't carried through. So if we deny in the classroom this reality, we're just feeding into that larger denial. But if we deny this reality in our institutional practices and act as if it's something, that a few faculty do, or it's nice that it's included in a classroom, then we also are participating in denial. And so these are just some of the different ways that over the years we've worked on this. But I tell you, if you don't get this into policy statements, the moment somebody leaves, you've got to fight the battle all over again. So this is some of our work in cultivating practices. I put in my syllabus that I don't want to see bottled water when we have water bottle dispensers and they can get a reusable bottle. And I talk to them about why. I talk to them about what is the ethical reach of a disposable bottle of plastic water. Whose water is it that is being taken? How is it being produced? What's the petroleum? Why are we taking water from California and drinking it in New Jersey? So that's just one of the things. And so in my syllabus, I talk about the kind of practices. But these are other ways. We have a graduation green pledge that students proudly wear that green ribbon to say they are going to take environmental and social responsibility into account in whatever job they get. We have a voluntary food covenant that's really important. And part of it is we agreed quite a long time ago to not serve mammal flesh, as we call it, to sort of recognize the dimensions of climate footprint, of CAFO practices, of energy and water consumption, of health issues, of who is it that lives near these huge animal feedlots, how the animals are treated. That as an institution, if we weren't willing to sort of say where our money goes counts, then we're pretty empty in the classroom. And I think you can read all the rest of that, and we've had some good practices here. We have a garden, and I can't say much about a garden after Tim talks about the farm. But it's been a really exciting place, as was cooking together from the garden and having a feast and having people share their food traditions. One of the exciting places is what happens in chapel, and it is my great pleasure that chapel, as a Quaker, happens usually without my having much input, meaning that the students and the people planning chapel are busy uncovering the liturgies, the hymns, the rituals, and these are just some different places of observing the seasons, of blessing the seeds, of recognizing our connection as earthlings, as Adamah, earth creatures, and these are both about trash and water pollution. Really powerful, from two different classes who never met each other but came up with similar ideas. Chapel and the ways we come together are rich, rich practices. This is an example of stall talk, and that is put something in the bathroom stalls that gives people something to think about. And this was a campaign we did when we introduced our water bottle stations and we gave out water bottles. This was one of the examples of stall talk. This got undergraduates thinking about it, you know. And you've heard of some of the other schools, what they're doing. Blessing of the animals, labyrinths, interfaith. This is some of the most important, exciting interfaith work you can be doing. And I find for my students, that's one of the most valuable parts, is that they realize we are all working together because we have just one earth. Here are just some more examples of seminaries sort of putting it out there, whether it's marching for the climate, working on divestment issues, this is cleaning up a stream, the kind of practices of getting your students out. So, what is our task? Provide the grounding and imagination found in hermeneutical explorations of sacred text. Enliven theological imagination to re-inhabit our religious traditions. Understand the ethical implications and obligations of environmental justice. Expand the circle of concern. Broaden worship and ritual practices to include awe, wonder, lament, confession, and commitment. Take religion outdoors. That's where it started in all of our traditions. Connect eco-theology so that it's no longer eco, it's theology. It is about all the common concerns. Expand our understanding of counseling and psychology, because our students are going to be the ones helping people come to terms with the health issues, the destruction of their communities. If we don't understand that as humans, it is vital to our being to be connected to the rest of creation, then we have a pretty shrunken view of humanity. Enliven religious education, as Tim has taught us. Help students, and Helen teaches us. Help students understand all of the dimensions that Laudato Si and this morning's did, and of Elaine's, to encourage these kind of changed practices and changed identities, to change institutional practices so that we walk our talk, to become earthlings again. Adamah, walking in balance, breathing God's breath in community, conspiring together. So I want to thank you and remind you, heaven is both under our feet as well as over our heads. It's a skewed idea if we think it isn't already with us. Thank you.